All right, let's turn back now to what we heard from Washington, D.C. today. We talked earlier about the comments we heard from Dr. Tony Fauci on the coronavirus front, but we also heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin. Brian Cheung joins us now for all of that commentary. And Brian, I guess, what was the tone of the proceedings, and was there any signal maybe on Treasury's willingness, the administration's willingness to start thinking about extending or kind of refilling the coffer on the CARES Act at the end of next month?
Well, I think you can really tell the tone of the hearing based on the fact that the visuals showed them wearing masks. So you had Jerome Powell wearing a mask in the hearing today, whereas Stephen Mnuchin wearing it occasionally during the course of that hearing with the House Financial Services Committee today. This is a hearing that's happening in late June. This is not the first time that either the Treasury Secretary or the Fed Chair have had to testify to Congress. They were doing that a few months ago when maybe the more optimism in the market would have said maybe we wouldn't have needed this hearing at the end of June. So here you have Treasury Secretary Mnuchin being very closely watched for any sort of details on what might be in that next fiscal package. Something that was discussed was PPP, for example. The Treasury Secretary saying he could see a case for re-upping maybe a small pot of new PPP money, with it having expired yesterday with over $100 billion going unused. But then on the monetary policy side of things, you had Jerome Powell saying that, quote, a second outbreak could force government and force people to withdraw again from economic activity, end quote. He said that there would be loss of confidence if there were to be a failure on the health response here in the United States to contain the virus, as we've seen in states like Arizona, Florida, California, a lot of those cases really cropping back up, arguably not a second outbreak per se, but just a continuation of that first outbreak. A few other kind of interesting points that were in this testimony. One thing that was obviously in view was the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending program, its efforts to offer loans to businesses with less than 15,000 employees or less than $5 billion in annual revenue. The Federal Reserve, which still has yet to actually get any of that money into borrowers' hands, says that it could lower the minimum loan size. It could also include an asset-based test for eligibility over EBITDA, which is something that's being included right now. There's an argument that some businesses might not qualify because they don't have an EBITDA-based kind of business model. And then one other thing that was kind of interesting was that apparently the Federal Reserve and the Treasury were looking at some point at some sort of commercial mortgage-backed security or commercial real estate-backed facility. Federal Reserve and the Treasury ultimately decided not to do that. Mnuchin saying that there were structural issues with that and said if anything were to be done on relieving funding pressures for hotels, for example, that should be something that Congress should do. But regardless, nothing particularly new. It seemed like, if anything, the bigger focus was really on Treasury Secretary Mnuchin for any details on that next fiscal package.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Brian. I think everyone is rightly focused on getting the CARES Act extended and some kind of enhanced unemployment benefits hanging in, because we saw how clean the data was in terms of bolstering incomes. Consumer spending has been pretty solid over the last couple of months, all things considered. But you mentioned the Main Street lending facility from the Fed. It does feel like there's been a gap in how to get money to businesses. I'm not really sure what the solution is, but it's clear there needs to be one, because the PPP ran out today. There was still money that hadn't been taken up yet. So whether it's the conditions on these loans, the way that they're working with banks to get them to businesses, there's clearly a gap, I think, on the business side. And I think everyone is bracing and concerned that there will be a lot of business failures as we get into the second half of the year if that situation doesn't turn around. All right, Brian Cheung, thanks for joining the program. We will talk to you, of course, coming up later in the month.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.